Ethan checked his watch again. The traffic had made him late, and he could already feel the tight knot of irritation in his chest. He had promised himself 5 minutes at most, and then he would escape this blind date that his friends had insisted on dragging him into. The city street smelled of damp asphalt and roasted coffee, and the neon lights flickered in the drizzle. As he approached the small cafe, he could see a woman sitting near the window, her hair catching the dim light, and she looked up as if sensing his arrival. Her eyes met his for a fleeting moment, and something inside him twisted unexpectedly. He entered the cafe brushing water from his jacket and trying to appear casual, his usual armor of indifference in place. Yet the moment she smiled, he felt a jolt. Her smile was bright and warm, lighting up her face in a way that made him pause in the doorway. He forced himself to step forward, yet his heartbeat had already betrayed him. She gestured toward the empty chair across from her, and he hesitated before moving closer, his mind racing with reasons to leave, and yet he could not bring himself to speak the words that would end the evening before it had begun. And as he sat, he noticed the little things: the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, and for a moment he wondered if this was a trick of the light or a fleeting illusion. Clara broke the silence first, her voice soft and melodic, but with a firmness that made it impossible to ignore. She asked about his day, and he replied cautiously, keeping his tone neutral, trying to maintain the plan to leave soon. But as she shared a small story about her morning, the way she had almost spilled her coffee and laughed at herself, he found himself leaning in without realizing it. The sound of her laughter wrapped around him, pulling at something long dormant inside, and as he tried to remind himself of the 5-minute rule, he noticed a sudden movement outside the window, a shadow passing too quickly to identify, and a chill ran down his spine, because it felt almost as if someone were watching them from the street. Glanced around the cafe, noticing the other patrons busy with their own conversations. But the feeling of being observed did not fade. It lingered at the edges of his mind, tugging at him, making him uneasy, yet strangely alert. And as Clara continued to speak, her hands animatedly describing a chance encounter on the subway, he found himself caught between two impulses: the desire to flee and the irresistible pull of her presence. The contrast made his chest tighten, and he realized that he had never felt anything quite like it before, a magnetic draw that ignored logic or plans. And he wondered if it was foolishness or fate that had brought him here tonight. The rain outside intensified, the soft patter against the windows mixing with the distant hum of the city, and he noticed the reflection of his own face in the glass. Beside hers, it was a stranger staring back at him, someone cautious, reserved, and yet captivated in a way that scared him more than he wanted to admit. He tried to speak, casually asking about her work, but his words faltered as she tilted her head and smiled again, the smile that had stopped him in his tracks, and with it, the knot of irritation in his chest began to loosen, leaving behind a strange flutter of anticipation and a hint of vulnerability he had not felt in years. Suddenly a loud crash from the street startled both of them. A trash can had tipped over, scattering papers and debris across the sidewalk, and Ethan instinctively reached toward Clara as if to shield her, yet she laughed again, brushing the rain off her sleeve with a grace that made him feel clumsy and awkward, yet alive in a way that startled him. She turned her eyes fully on him and said something that made him blink, and for a moment time seemed to slow. The rest of the cafe disappeared, and he realized that the 5 minutes he had promised himself had already passed long ago, and that the night was far from over. Ethan found himself captivated by every nuance of her expression. Her voice, every gesture seemed to anchor him in a moment he did not want to escape. He caught himself imagining what it would be like to hear her laugh again, to see that smile in the sunlight, and the thought both exhilarated and terrified him because it threatened every plan he had made about staying guarded and leaving early. And as the waiter approached to take their order, he realized he had not even looked at the menu, and yet he could not bring himself to care. Outside the window, the shadows shifted again, and Ethan felt the prickling sensation of being on the edge of something unknown, something larger than himself, and the city hummed around them, carrying whispers of possibility and danger, and he sensed that the night had only just begun, and that every heartbeat might carry him closer to a truth he could not yet name, and Clara's laughter floated above it all. And he knew that leaving now was no longer an option, and that the mystery of her presence was only starting to unfold. Ethan could not stop watching her every movement as she spoke about things that seemed simple yet felt profound in a way that made him question how little he had noticed the world around him before her laughter echoed again, and something inside him shifted. He realized that the night had begun to carry its own rhythm, a rhythm that pulled him forward into moments he could not anticipate. And as the candlelight flickered between them, he felt the weight of every plan he had made dissolve into uncertainty. Clara suddenly paused, leaning closer across the small table, her eyes searching his, and Ethan felt a strange warmth that made his chest tight. He wanted to speak, yet the words would not come, and a sudden gust of wind rattled the window behind them, making the glass tremble, and for a fleeting second he imagined the world outside as dangerous and unpredictable, and then he wondered if it was the night itself testing him, or if it was her presence that had made him vulnerable in a way he had never allowed. The waiter returned with their drinks, but neither of them paid attention, as if the rest of the cafe had vanished, and Ethan noticed how her fingers wrapped around her cup the way she exhaled softly, letting go of something invisible, and he felt an urge to reach across the table to touch her hand, to anchor himself to this reality. But he hesitated because he feared that any action might shatter the fragile connection that had formed in the span of hours. And outside, a shadow flickered once more across the rain-slicked street, and Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine. Clara laughed suddenly at a story she had just told, and the sound was like a key unlocking something long sealed within him, and he laughed too, though it came out awkward and unexpected, and he felt exposed yet exhilarated. She leaned back, brushing the strand of hair from her face, and for a moment their eyes locked, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between them, and Ethan wondered if she could see the walls he had built, and if she could understand the pull he felt toward her. And the distant sound of sirens, or perhaps footsteps, made him glance toward the window, and the street outside seemed different, as if something or someone had noticed. A sudden movement near the door made them both turn, and Ethan's pulse quickened. A man had entered quickly, looking around before settling into a shadowed corner, his presence strange and almost threatening, and yet he did not approach. Instead he lingered there, a silent observer whose gaze seemed to pierce the fragile bubble Ethan had been inhabiting. And Clara's smile faltered for a heartbeat, and Ethan felt the tension coil in his chest, because he could not tell if the danger was real or imagined. And the rain intensified outside, masking other noises yet amplifying the sense of something waiting just beyond the glass. Ethan leaned forward, finally breaking the spell that had held him silent. He asked her something trivial, but his voice betrayed the tremor of awareness that had gripped him, and she smiled reassuringly, leaning closer once more, and he realized that this was a test of courage, or perhaps a moment that would define everything to come. And the stranger in the corner shifted slightly, as if sensing the change in energy, and Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with exhilaration, because he understood that leaving now would mean abandoning more than a blind date. It would mean walking away from something unpredictable and potentially life-changing. The clock ticked unnoticed on the wall, and neither of them looked at it yet. Ethan felt the invisible hand of time pressing gently against him, reminding him of the reality he had ignored for so long, yet he could not move because Clara's eyes held him captive, and her laughter rose again, a sound that made him ache with longing. And the shadow outside the window seemed to move closer, as if the night itself were leaning in to witness what was unfolding. And Ethan knew with a certainty that surprised him that the 5 minutes he had promised himself were long gone, and that the path ahead was unknown and dangerous and utterly irresistible. As they stood to leave the cafe together, the wind blew harder, scattering leaves and small debris across the sidewalk, and Ethan instinctively reached for her hand, and she took it without hesitation. And in that instant, the world shifted completely, and the stranger at the door had vanished without a trace, leaving only a lingering sense of mystery and possibility. and Ethan realized that every plan he had made about keeping his heart safe had been undone by a single smile, and that the night had only begun to reveal what fate had in store for them, and the city around them seemed to hold its breath.